What makes a novel count as literary fiction? Is it more impressive than commercial fiction? And what's the difference? Today, I'm going to give you my highly opinionated and polarizing take on this question as a novelist, reader, and human being. So stick around until the end if you want to either yell amen at me or throw something at your computer screen. Ready? Let's go. For years, I was confused by the term literary fiction. I found it very daunting, actually. Clearly, it seemed I was supposed to be writing literary fiction if I was going to write fiction at all, because it was the kind of fiction that wins awards, that gets reviewed in the New York Times, and that must have meant that you're really, really smart if you're writing it, right? I mean, why wouldn't you want to write that kind of fiction? The problem was that I'd often read books categorized as literary fiction and be underwhelmed. Like, really? That? It wasn't that I thought they were bad. I just didn't see how they were any better than the more plot-driven books that I would devour in one sitting. It seemed a little bit like The Emperor is Wearing No Clothes, honestly. Like, some books seemed to be considered more impressive and prestigious simply because they didn't have a plot, which struck me as arbitrary at best. Like, why was there something inherently lowbrow about having a plot? And couldn't you have a great plot and have great character development and rich prose? Why did conversations about literary and commercial fiction make it sound like books were only one or the other? So I just decided to research for myself. I did a deep dive. I read a bunch of novels in all genres and categories with the intent to understand for myself why these novels were categorized the way they were. And I came up with my own theory. Here it is. First, you have to understand that genres are marketing categories. That's what they are. They exist to sell your book. This is not a science. Your book's genre is an art, a marketing art. Jodi Picoult's books, for example, are categorized as women's fiction because that's how booksellers sell Jodi Picoult's books. Now, here's a quote from Jodi about her novel, The Storyteller. She says, "I've heard The Storyteller described as chick lit, which is hilarious to me because there's nothing wrong at all with chick lit, but it tends to be lighthearted and comedic, and there's nothing in my novel that qualifies. It's about the Holocaust, for God's sake, and that's not exactly a fluffy topic." So yes, first know that they are marketing categories. Next, you need to know that books can be and often are categorized as more than one thing. A book can be literary fiction and a mystery, or a literary fiction mystery that's also commercial. It can be sci-fi that's also women's fiction. You get the idea. You don't just have to have one category if you're a book. Remember, these are marketing categories, and marketing departments are going to choose whichever categories are most likely to sell the book. If we were to make a Venn diagram of how these categories overlap, it would look kind of like a massive scribble with no circles in it. Okay, now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's break down some genres, shall we? First, the literary versus commercial distinction. When a book is categorized as commercial fiction, that just means that the publisher thinks it's possible for it to sell a huge number of copies because it has a good plot that keeps people turning the pages. It can also be character-driven and stunningly written, which are the hallmarks of literary fiction. But to be called commercial essentially means that it has a good plot. Okay? Commercial equals good plot. Now, if a book is described as literary, then by definition, it has strong character development. And if it's literary and commercial, it's called upmarket. And that means it has a good plot and good character development. Got it? So commercial equals good plot. Literary equals good character development, meaning they are psychologically complex, and that's part of the allure to readers. If it's literary and commercial, it's called upmarket. Now, here's where my own opinion comes in, but I'm right. If a book is only literary and not commercial, so it's not upmarket, all that really means is it doesn't have a good plot. And listen, it's okay for a book not to have a good plot. That's fine, but that's what it means. Otherwise, they'd call it upmarket because then they could sell more copies of it that way. And there's no reason not to call it upmarket unless it doesn't have a good plot. You can't call a book without a good plot upmarket. Traditionally, the category of solely literary fiction, though, has mostly been filled by male authors, and it tends to be the category that leads to the big awards, the Pulitzer, Booker, and to prestigious reviews in the New York Times, etc. So we must add to our list, if it's only literary, that equals not a good plot. Quick note, when I'm writing and teaching, I think the sweet spot is upmarket. That's what I try to write and what I try to teach writers to write. You want to write your best possible book, so literary, but you also want to sell copies. And to me, that makes upmarket the sweet spot. Now, last definition I want to share before we get into my TED Talk that will change your life. What is women's fiction? As you heard in that Jodi Picoult quote earlier, women's fiction most basically means written by a woman with a woman protagonist. It's marketed this way to sell copies, because according to some research, around 80% of book buyers are women. Women's fiction is rarely also categorized as literary fiction for some reason, even though, remember, the Venn diagram is a scribble, and so overlapping categories are widely accepted, and even though women's fiction is often about the same stuff as literary fiction, namely relationships. This is a mystery as to why, but is it? Still, women's fiction almost always has a decent plot, and it is therefore rarely considered for awards or prestigious reviews because those institutions tend to look down on anything with a plot as a kind of common man's entertainment. Okay, if you stuck with me this far, you're really dedicated, so I'm going to reward you with my highly polarizing opinion now. Get excited. Okay, so we covered that genres can overlap, right? And if something is only literary, that means it doesn't have a decent plot driving the page turning, and that these books are most often considered for awards. Why might that be? Why do we view as cheaper or unremarkable readers who turn the pages in order to find out what happens next, and the writers who write for them? What does it say about us that we value reading for any reason other than suspense to be more worthy of accolades? I think it's classism. When something has mass appeal, like a good plot, by definition, it can't be good. Only one publishing genre is defined by the absence of something, and that's literary fiction, the absence of a plot. Does it make sense then that that's the category that's most awarded? To award people who aren't writing plot for not writing plot? Especially when maybe the reason they aren't doing it is because they can't. Meanwhile, the great irony is that if you can write a good plot and good characterization, you can write great commercial upmarket fiction. But it's less likely to be considered for awards, especially if you're a woman author, because it will be categorized as women's fiction to sell more books. Still, you tell me which is more impressive, writing commercial upmarket fiction or writing solely literary fiction. All right, my diatribe is over, but here's a takeaway for you. Try to write upmarket fiction. It has commercial appeal, but it also investigates character deeply enough to be called literary, at least if you're a man. If you're a woman, it might be called women's fiction because all of this is marketing and you're a woman and publishers want you to sell books. If you know how to do it, you can choose not to do it, and you'll be able to make an empowered choice that way. All right, if you've made it this far, I'm guessing that you're writing a book or you want to write a book. And if so, I want to hear from you. When I'm not writing, my mission in life is to help writers write their dream books. I love it. I live for it. I teach my process for writing a novel in my program, The Book Incubator. If you're curious to know more, I have a free video walking you through my exact process for writing a book, and you can get it by clicking below and just answering 2 questions to apply to the program. You get the video whether you join or not, so no pressure to enroll. Just click below, tell me a little bit about yourself and your book or your book idea, and that's it. Can't wait to hear from you.